Hello everyone, welcome to Code and Learn. So now that we have covered the basics of Go language, it is now time to build a project. So for our first project, we are going to build a REST API server. If you're already aware of the client-server architecture, you can skip this part. I'm just going to go over the client-server architecture and the basic of REST to get started. In our real life, it is very common to have a client-server architecture when working with your devices that pull data from a cloud server. So for example, here we have a client which is your mobile phone. It is fetching data from a server that could be residing in any of the cloud offerings from different companies or on premises of a third-party company. So for example, if we want to get news on our mobile phone, your mobile phone will send a request to the backend API server to fetch data, and in response, your server will respond with the news data. That news data will be displayed on your screen. That's basically the client-server architecture, where your mobile phone is the client requesting data or the one requesting data, and the backend API server is your server that is sending back response data to the request. So that is the basic client-server architecture. This is the most common architecture that we see around different devices. So your client could be your TV, streaming YouTube videos from a server, your iPad, or any other tablet, etc. Now let's move on to the REST API stuff. So what is a REST API? REST APIs are basically built upon HTTP protocol, that is Hypertext Transfer Protocol, where your client sends a request, and based on the URL and the HTTP method, you can access or manipulate data on that backend API server. So the basic CRUD operations can be performed with different HTTP method. For example, post can be used to create a resource, while get can be used to fetch a resource. Then there's put or patch that can be used to update a resource. Then delete, as the name suggests, can be used to delete a resource. I've just covered these four, but there are other HTTP methods that can be used to perform different operations. URL or Uniform Resource Locator can be used to perform these operations. For example, I can fetch users with a URL users. Then if I wanted to fetch a particular user, I can provide the ID of the user. So I can say user/user ID, and then I can fetch that user data. So that's the role of URL. There are other options as well when it comes to API, but REST is the most popular one that is commonly used. And the most common request and response data is in the form of JSON. Earlier, we used to also have XML, but JSON is the new popular option. We will be using Go to build our news API server. Through this project, we will be learning how to set up a HTTP server with Go, having HTTP handlers and testing them with unit tests, routing different requests to different handlers, middlewares. Later on in this project, we will be using a Postgres database to store our news data. Then we will also use test containers to test this database or our different database operations. Then we will also look at mocking and testing with mocks. And finally, we will Dockerize our application so that it can be used to deploy on a cloud infrastructure. The news API server, as the name suggests, is going to work on the news resource. So we will create news, get news, update news, and then delete news. These are the few operations that we will perform using the news API server. So that's it for the introduction. Let us now dive into the code. Now let's first initialize our module here. For that, I will just run comod init and say news API. Cool. First thing I'm going to do is create a CMD directory, and inside it, we will have our API server. CMD, then API server, and inside that, we will have our main.go. Package main. So let's just create a HTTP server and start it. If error is equal to http.listen and serve, first is the address we listen to. For now, I will just say 8080, and then for the handler, we will just specify nil. Log.fatal, let's say failed to start server, and then pass the error. Here we just need to do error not is equal to nil. So that's it for starting a server. Let me clear the console and try to run it. Go run cmd API server main.go. We got nothing printed to the console because we are not printing anything, but our server is now running. The next thing I'm going to do is create an internal directory which will hold our internal packages, which are again not for export. Inside that, let us create a package handler. This will have all our handlers in here. Then let us create handler.go. So we are going to have 5 handlers. A handler to get all news, a handler to get news by ID, handler to delete a news, a handler to create a news, and a handler to update a news. So I can say package handler, and inside it, let us create our first handler, which is post news. Post news, it will return a handler func that will be used to handle the incoming request. Inside it, we will just return a handler func. So for now, we are just going to write not implemented to the response. So I can say w.writeHeader http.not implemented. That's it. So this handler is here to create a news resource. Next, let us create a handler to get all news. Get all news. Similar to above, we will do handler func. I will just copy paste this into here. This is just to get our skeleton going. Next is get news by ID http.handler func. Then update news by ID http.handler func. Do the same. And then lastly, our delete news by ID. Delete news by ID http. So all these handlers are not implemented yet, but we are setting up our skeleton, so later on we can implement them. Along with this, I will also add a test file, handler underscore test.go package handler test. I'm just going to put all the handlers on this side, close the sidebar, and now let us set up our skeleton for tests or testing the handler. First, we will do function test post news test cases. For now, we will just have the name of the test, and then let us iterate through the test cases to run the test. t.run tc.name. Then forgot to add range here, so that's it. The first test we will have is what we have here, which is not implemented. I will also add a expected status field, which is of type int, name not implemented. We will later replace this with actual test cases. Expected status http.not implemented. Inside a test, first we will set up. So arrange the test. Let's create a recorder which will record our response http test.new recorder. Similarly, now let's create a request that we will use to send a request to the handler. So for method, we will say http.method post, URL is nothing, and empty string for the body. It doesn't return an error, so we only need to have request here. Now let's act. Basically, I'm following the pattern of AAA, which is arrange, act, and assert, which is used for testing. So I can import the handler dot post news. Then, since it's a function, we call it passing the response writer and the request. Now we assert on the response status. If w.result.status code is not equal to tc.expected status, we error. That is t.errorf expected but got tc.expected status, and then w.result.status code. So that's our structure of our test. Since the handle has not been implemented, we expect this to pass. Let's now run the test and make sure it's passing. Before running the test, one thing we forgot to do is pass an empty pass. If you pass an empty string, it will error out because it expects a URL. With all set, now let's run our test to make sure it's working. And as you can see, our tests are working fine and we are getting what we expected. So I'm going to copy this structure to add tests for other handlers. We need 4 more. 1, 2, 3, and 4. Let's update them. Next to post, we will have get all news Here we update it to get all news. Then we have get news by ID, update get news by ID, then update news by ID, update here. Finally, delete news by ID. So that's all the tests we have for handlers. Now let us run them all to make sure that they are working as we expect them. So I will do go test and pass a string to make sure that the command recursively checks for all the test files in our directories and run them. And as you can see, all the handler tests are passing now. I will close this and this too. Next, let us hook these handlers to routes. For that, I will create a router package. And inside it, we will do router.go. You don't really need to create a package for this, but just for having a better structure, I'm creating a new package. Router. I will create a constructor function, new router, func, new router. It returns a sermux. So http sermux. Let's create the sermux, http.new sermux, and return it. Instead of new router, I will just do new because we are already in the package router. So the path will be router.new. New creates a new router with all the handlers configured. Now let's set up all the routes. First, we need to have a post route or create news route. For this, I will do r.handle function, which accepts a pattern for the route. We will say post request to news route and then pass the handler for that, handler dot post news. Next, I will create a route to get all news, r.handle function get /news, then handler dot get all news, then the rest of them. For this, I will use a path param of news underscore ID. Then we can do handler dot get news by ID, update news by ID, r dot handler func, put request to /news underscore ID. For handler, we will do handler dot update news by ID, and then the last one, which is delete news by ID. R dot handler func, we say delete /news underscore ID, handler dot delete news. To specify a path param, we are using curly braces and inside the name of the path param. So the name will be used when we want to fetch the ID inside the handler. We will see that later. For now, we have set up our routes. Now let's get back to the server and instead of nil, provide the router. So we can say r router dot new and then provide it here. That's it. Now let's run our server. Go run and let's try to call one of the routes. Let us try to get all news. And here, as you can see, we get the not implemented response back. That means our router and handlers are working as expected. But we don't see nothing here. In the next section, we will add a logger to the server so that we can log the incoming request and also log errors and other useful information in our server side. Until next time, happy coding.